policy coherence and international coordination. As we have been doing for the other task forces, we would like to first launch the task force statement, and for that I'll call on the co-chairs on the stage. So as I call your name, please come to the stage. N.R. Bhanumurthy, Albert Park, Gulbin Sahin Bayoglu, Harshavardhan Singh, Heungchong Kim, Marcus Karamuru, Pami Dua, Radhika Kapoor, Tetsushi Shinobe, Vera Helena Thorstensen, and Jose Rizal Damuri. And we have a big round of applause for the task force members for all the hard work this year. Could I please request the speakers to stay back on stage? So our panel discussion for this session is titled Macro Policies for Securing Livelihoods, Rethinking Macroeconomics in Trade. Could I invite the panelists on stage as I call your name? Abla Abdel-Latif, Executive Director and Director of Research, the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Heungchong Kim, President, the Korean Association of APEC Studies. Vera Helena Thorstensen, Head, Center for Global Trade and Investment Studies, FGV Brazil. Jose Rizal Damuri, Executive Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. And the session is to be chaired by Radhika Kapoor, Senior Visiting Fellow, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, India. Over to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much. Big thank you to T20 and ORF for putting this together and for the last 8 months, very productive 8 months. And of course, I'd also like to thank all the authors of the policy briefs who've actually provided inputs to put this document together. I know most of them are not here, but a big thank you to them as well. As we release this task force communique on macroeconomics, trade and livelihoods, policy coherence and international coordination, I think it's important to acknowledge that this task force has produced this communique at a period when there has been immense global economic uncertainty. And it's worth reflecting on how things have evolved over the course of the last 8 months, because that has shaped the conversations in our group. Now, the IMF tells us, the recently released World Economic Outlook, that global economy is gradually recovering from the pandemic and from the geopolitical crisis. They have revised global growth forecast upwards from 2.8% to 3%. Nevertheless, the document does say that we are not out of the woods yet. Rising interest rates in response to inflation weigh down economic activity. Global headline inflation is expected to decline sharply by 2 percentage points, but core inflation continues to remain high. It expects that it's going to decline far more gradually, and in fact, in 2024, they have revised their projections upwards. Now, in this present environment of low growth, inflation, and rising interest rates in mature economies, this entire environment poses a very complex set of challenges for the global economy as a whole, but for developing and emerging markets in particular, because macro policies in advanced economies have spillover effects on emerging and developing markets specifically. What makes matters worse is also the fact that prospects for trade growth are quite bleak. The WTO tells us that trade growth is expected to slow down to 1.7% in 2023. The pace of trade growth is going to be subpar, again on account of geopolitical uncertainties, increasing interest rates, tighter monetary policy. And put together, the bleak prospects of growth, the weak growth, combined with bleak prospects for trade growth, have implications for employment creation and livelihoods. Now, in this backdrop, for the benefit of those who were not a part of the task force, the work in this task force was divided into 3 streams. The first work stream was monetary synchronization in fiscal space. The second was trade, investment, and supply chain resilience. And the third was employment and livelihoods. And what we did through the course of our work over the last 8 months was that in our deliberations, we not only focused on each of these work streams separately, but how they connect together. So for example, we didn't look at just coordination between monetary and fiscal policy within G20 countries, but also how we can have better coherence between monetary and fiscal policies and trade and investment policies, and then how can these together revive growth? Growth that is not just inclusive and sustainable, but also job-rich and create jobs for women and youth. So in this backdrop, let me start by posing my first question to Dr. Kim, which is on our first work stream of monetary synchronization in fiscal space. Dr. Kim, we'd like to get your thoughts on how do you think we can promote better coordination within G20 member countries on monetary and fiscal policy, in particular given that central bankers in advanced countries have shown limited interest in any sort of coordination mechanism. So what can the G20 actually do effectively so that macro policies in advanced countries in the global north have least disruptive effects or spillovers on emerging and developing markets in the global south more generally?
Thank you very much, moderator. And first of all, I'd like to thank for having me in this very informative and insightful meetings here. And I am very happy and honored to join the Task Force 1. And during the 8 months of our work, it was really interesting and stimulating to talk about the many macroeconomic and trade issues together with the other colleague. And you talk about the macroeconomic stabilization and the harmonization, and how to do that. And you already mentioned that the difficulties of the harmonization. But I'd like to talk about something about the information sharing and then precise prescription to the current situation, including early warning system, and also revolutionary technology progress and its expansion to the daily life of people are needed. Let me explain some more in detail. As the pandemic hit the world economy from the demand and supply side together simultaneously, and the world is now getting weaker against any aftershocks. So higher volatility in demand for certain durables, for instance, resulted in after the pandemic. And so economic cycle, country by country, became more synchronized. So this is actually the worst condition for the world economy. So in order to smooth out the demand for goods intertemporally, we need to harmonize the macroeconomic policies of each country. So sometimes, synchronization of macro policy together with supply side shocks from the technology revolution are required. So that's what I'm saying. But it's really difficult to harmonize the macroeconomic policy because the prerequisite of this harmonization is information sharing, which as some countries are really willing to provide the information of each countries, but in many cases, because of the stigma effect, many countries find it difficult to forward the information sharing. So in order to do that, I think that the multilateral institutions, the role of these institutions need to be strengthened and also should be highlighted. And so information sharing first. Second, precise prescription to the current situation, and also produce the proper method, such as the early warning system that the Task Force 1, the recommendation of the Task Force 1. And also, we need to talk about the supply shock, positive shock. What I mean is the revolutionary technology progress, and then it's very, very rapid expansion to the people's daily life. It's very important to smooth out all these kind of shocks. I mean, intertemporally. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I can move to you, Vera, now to our second work stream, which was on trade. What role do you think the G20 can play there to boost not just trade, but also investment flows and enhance supply chain resilience in the backdrop of trends of rising protectionism and a return to industrial policy that we've seen in a post-COVID era?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And let me tell you just that I just arrived from a big conference on the Society of International Economic Law. That is the place where all the big persons discuss trade, investment, and certainly environment. And well, I don't have good news for you, because, well, we built a system of trade for more than 60 years. And now, guess what's going on? First, a big lesson is that trade was transformed in security issues. Nobody talks anymore about anti-dumping tariff and all these things. Everybody's talking about Article 21. Do you know what the GATT 21 article is? You know about 20, that is, for environment, we can do anything. 21 is about war, is about special security issues. And remember what happened. Some years ago, Mr. Trump decided to use this article to say no more steel and aluminum because we are going to raise tariff. And then what happened, a war of steel with the European Union and automobiles and so on. And after this issue, there's some examples how security is becoming the main issue of trade. Because for security issue, you can do anything. We have problems with Ukraine and Russia after the Crimea War and so on. This is the first big point. The second, and perhaps the most interesting for us, is about what we call the neo-industrial policy. Do you know what's this? I was a professor of economics for a long time. I started my life talking about Prebisch, you know, states, subsidies, and so on. Now, and then I learned you have to be a liberal, now liberal one. So it's dead. Neoliberalism is dead. Now you have the new industrial policy that is about state, a huge amount of subsidies, a war of subsidies, and things, do what you want to make the sectors you want to. And this is about resilience. We talk about decoupling. Now we are talking about the risking, funny thing, and friendshore and also. And so let's see what's going to happen with the new value chains, the regional trends. The third main issue that we talk about a lot about is the famous critical materials. Look, everything used, computers, nice vehicles and all. But we talk, first we discuss that, where are these minerals? Now we discuss who is going to process them. And this is the first cynicism of our life now. That is, the Europeans and Americans, yes, you are going to use electrical vehicles. Go to the numbers, go to the papers, and try to see how many tons of minerals do you need. For each car, 2 tons. For eolic, 100 tons. And look what's going on. There is no such an amount of minerals available now. Probably they are going to discover them. But the big problem is there's just one country processing minerals because of the amount of energy they use and because of the amount of residuals. Do you know that 90% of residuals you need to inject, to do something with them, to get what you need for your car? So what I said is a big cynicism of the rich countries say, I'm going to use electrical car, and guess where these minerals will come from and who is going to process them. And tell me what we are going to do with the rejects. Now, the 4 points, and this is the point for me that's the most important. Remember, in the first meeting of this G20, I start discussing with you the main issues that is, okay, environment is important. No question about this. We have to do something. Now, what's happened? WHO starts to constructing a huge data bank on the trade measures related to environment. That's what we call TREMS. And remember, in the first meeting, I talked about 14,000. Then the second meeting, I talked about 15. Now I can talk about 17. The funny thing is half of this amount, the total, the Secretariat discovered and listed, it is on the data bank, but the countries only notify half. Tell me why. Why countries are hiding this kind of information for us? What kind of rules, new measures of environment they are going to use against us? The second, and this is, when you talk about TREMS, you are talking about TBT, the technical badge to trade, it's a big GATT issue, and we have you have the big institutions of ISO, followed by the European Union, and the United States hates ISO and use 300 standardizing bodies. So put this aside. Now move to the second big system that is to measure what is called the private sectors. Private sectors, the big non-government organizations, they are helping us to really produce green products. The basis of these are completely different from the regulatory issues of ISO and standardizing body, completely different. And we use these mainly for organic food and all this kind of thing. And they are using for industrial products. And the funny thing is that this is the most interesting issue. The way you measure the emission of carbon in the steel in the United States is not accepted in Europe. The famous carbon club created by G7 gets a new result because the big countries cannot accept the same standards of one of the other. Come on, what are you talking about? This is the second big system. Now go to the new, what's the new word of that we talked a lot about yesterday and today? ESG, so nice. What ESGs? We have the Mr. Fink interview in Economist last week. So marvelous. Everybody is using this. What is this? Is the way that accountants and auditors measure risk, measure value, money. The value that you are going to put some risk, and then do you have the money to pay for the risk that you are polluting? That's what they want. Tell me, how many standards there are already created by accountants and auditors? 600. Now finally, last 2 weeks ago, the Institute of Standardized Accounting Group of Finance Group, the Finance Report, decided to release the first 2 standards of ESGs, to put an order on the system. So you have 3 systems that are not talking to each other, and you decided to decide what is green or not, and reject to import your products from developing countries. And more important than this, and I will finish with this, is that there is a huge divide. Do you know why? Because who is developing all these standards? Rich countries from a temperate zone. Please go to your map, the Mappa Mundi, and take a look. You have all countries, the majority of countries in the north of the equator. You have, it's funny, you have Brazil and Argentina, and you have 1/3 of Africa and Australia and so on. You have India in the north of tropical country. But then all these kind of things that I'm talking about, standards, were developed by rich countries and temperate zones. And guess the big conclusion that people are discovering and proving that they are not fit for tropical countries. And to finish, I will give you some nice examples. A little cow in Brazil walk on the fields, they eat on the field. The manure is used to fertilize the field. The same cow in Switzerland, it's going in the barn, stay there, a heating one uses energy. And then they eat soybeans that came from Brazil by ship. Fantastic, the amount of pollution. This is not the same. As I told you, the way, and I agree with what was talked in the last panel, we need to change not only the way we measure things, the way we are evaluating things, and to put things in a more balanced way. This fight of temperate and tropical zones are really important. Let me give you another example. Do you know what's going on in Atacama Desert? The desert of Atacama is in Chile. Go to your Google and discover 78 billion tons of clothes, used clothes. Clothes are there in the air because it's dry. They are there. Who and Chile is buying this, receiving money, not buying, is receiving money to stock these old clothes. And do you know what they discover? That half of these clothes are new, completely new, unused, but are thrown there because of the next season of the fashion. The lovely European fashion houses, they have to come with new items. So the question for every one of you, how many clothes you buy by year, and what are you doing with your clothes? So this kind of way to see the issue of trade is for me, is more important point. And the last word is this. We need now to have what I call a diplomacy of standards. With this war of standards, you are not going anywhere, because this is the big fight of the North colonizing the South again. Thank you.
So that was a very powerful assertion of all the problems, Vera. But can I ask you in 1 minute to sort of say that this issue of standards, which is a critical problem, how can the G20 take a stab at fixing it?
This is the place to do. First, recognize that you have a problem. And more important than this, you have the legal basis in the Agenda 21. It is there. Article 7, Article 11, that you have to differentiate your criteria, developing countries, and more, that you have to treat tropical countries in the different way of the temperate one. It is there. It is the legal basis there. So a huge work for the G20 to start doing something.
All right. So then taking the issue of trade forward and linking it with employment. And Dr. Damuri, I'd like to turn to you here. You know, the return of protectionism, the rise of industrial policy once again, and the implications it has for trade flows hurts prospects of employment generation in developing countries. How do you look at this interrelationship between trade and employment generation, particularly through the lens of SMEs?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think Farah already lay out the current situations and how worrying actually that kind of current developments on trade. And I have to stress first on that, although there are a lot of weakness and disadvantage on trade activities. International trade activities actually already contribute a lot to the employment creation, especially in the developing countries. The emergence of a global value chain, for example, in the last 40, 50 years, has provided not only more jobs, but also more quality jobs. To the people in developing countries. But the current situations actually with all the rise of industrial policy, protectionisms, seems to make the futures a little bit bleak on the employment creations, because now the resilience, instead of economic interdependence becomes the mantra of international trade policy. But rather than improving resilience, but the current protectionist policy actually increased the uncertainty, the policy uncertainty and also business uncertainty. That's why I think this would hurt the employment creations. For example, you can see that the reshoring part or the how the developed business from developed countries are encouraged to come back to their home countries and then perhaps living and staying away from the developing nations. It's also the current technology also tends to be more capital intensive. The current technology for productions more capital intensive and demand less workers. That kind of things would be detrimental for the employment creations, especially in the developing nations. And it adds up the complexity, what already happens during the pandemic era, where the supply chain was disrupted very heavily, and it didn't really come back. I'm taking examples of Indonesia. In Indonesia, currently we are still there are still around 4 million people who previously worked in the formal sectors, no longer work in the formal sectors. Even the growth already there, the recovery is already there. So that kind of the prospects of the quality job and employment is very uncertain at the moment. On the SME, you mentioned about the SME participations, it's always low in the global value chains. And that with current situations, with protectionisms and more industrial policy, it's getting harder for SME to participate in the international trade activities. Like global trade alert platforms recording tracking the protectionist policy, recorded like 2,500 protectionist measures in 2022 alone. So these SMEs would face a very uncertain situations when they're trying to go internationally. And I think G20 can play critical roles in supporting the participations of SMEs in the international trade. Yeah.
So again, very quickly, in just 1 minute, I mean, what is the role that the G20 can, what concrete steps, be it in terms of access to information, markets, I mean, what can the G20 do there?
Yeah, I think G20 first can raise the awareness that the current situation, instead of improving the resilience, trade and economic resilience, and security and stability, it even detrimental to the global economy. It increase uncertainty and it discourages business to expand their activities. And on SME, actually one thing that the G20 can start is actually to try to measure the participations of SMEs in the GVC. We already talk about the participations of SMEs in GVC for quite a while, but we never really know. And what kind of indicator that we can use to measure the progress or the declines in this participation? I think G20 can start from that.
I think that's an absolutely valid point, because as a starting point for the conversation, we need to have that data, that information, and SMEs are also defined differently across the entire G20 horizon. And additionally, most of them are in the informal sector in developing economies. So getting a right measure and then tracking progress on that is, of course, a challenge. But that's a conversation where that's the G20 is perhaps the right forum to start having that conversation. Turning now to you, Dr. Latif. You were not a part of this task force, but what I wanted to get your thoughts on was on the issue of employment creation. One of the subjects that we delved into in greater detail on the subject of employment and livelihoods was bringing women back into the workforce. Now, of course, the issue of women-led development has been one of the key themes that India's G20 presidency has focused on. And what our task force highlighted was that it was important to bring women back into the workforce, into gainful economic activity, not just because it's a moral and social imperative, but because it is an economic imperative. Enhancing participation of women in the workforce has, enhances your GDP, productivity, efficiency, so on and so forth. So here, how do you think we can move ahead? How do we take forward the rhetoric and actually convert it into implementation?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this very, very important meeting. T20s are always important. T20 India is particularly important, I think, because it is having a special flavor of its own, adding and raising the voice of the South. And I also like very much the enthusiasm, the self-criticism, the sarcasm that we've seen in all the sessions, but we're starting with this one. And let me, before answering your question, very, very quickly, in 30 seconds, tell you about another feature of the messed world that we are living in, and the example will tell you a lot in itself. Of course, given the Russia-Ukraine war, no one discusses at all the horrors associated with it, the humanitarian part, etc., etc. But there's something very strange that's happening. Egyptians, all countries in the world, people, when they travel to the US to get their visa, they have to have vaccination. And in the past, the Russian vaccination was accepted for the visa. After the war, the Russian vaccination is no longer accepted. And this says a lot, really, about the vaccination and about what's happening, how politicized the system is. So it's really, I remember it when you were talking about all those jokes. But anyways, let me talk about women. Okay, everybody is talking about women-led development, the importance of involving women. In some of our calculations in Egypt, we found that if we actually push women to the job market and to earn income, this is going to increase our rate of growth of the economy in the next 10 years by over 30%, just by getting them back. They are educated, but they are not involved enough in the job market. The rhetoric messages are being repeated by everyone. The question is how to do it. The how question is never addressed fully, and I think the how question is best addressed by looking at specific success stories, particularly in the South, okay, at the micro level, at the community level, that can be actually scaled up and replicated in other countries. And here G20 can play a role. I could mention that at the end. But let me give you some specific examples, and also coming actually from Egypt. We did, in my center, a very interesting study asking women why they're not terribly involved in the entrepreneurial efforts and starting a business. I'm not talking about being employed in an organization or in a company. I'm talking about actually starting a business. And the answers showed things that are very interesting, and I'm sure they apply to all other countries. One, women do not have enough information about the opportunities and about how to do things. They get, particularly if they're in the rural areas, they get the information from their fathers, from their brothers, their husbands, who are not particularly keen on making them business people. Let's be very clear about that. So they don't have the information. This is one. Two, we found that the women who had exposure, the ones who lived in the cities, the ones who traveled, the ones who have seen success stories, doing a lot better and pushing things forward. And to try and get over that, we produced a guide for women, very interesting, starting with a psychometric test, when women actually test themselves by answering certain questions and calculating the score to know how fit they are for starting a business. Because when you ask someone, you say, do you want to start a business? You say, yes, of course. But when you actually know the type of responsibilities and risks, you change your mind. So psychometric test, information about MSMEs and the differences between them. And by the way, M should be left on its own. SMEs on the other side, they're completely different. presentation of all the regulations that exist in Egypt, all the steps, the procedures that they have to go through in order to start a business. And we actually pushed it and passed it on to the different organizations, and it became very useful. Another example is a project that we called Your Job Next to Your Home, okay? And this was actually very interesting, and it was initiated by an NGO, actually, getting big exporters in the country to collaborate with the government. The government in the specific governorates would build small factories as per the specifications of the exporter, as per the standards by the buyers. In the Western countries, these factories are rented to young people from the villages. The factories are built in the villages, okay? And the big exporter buys their product for the next 3 years. And this is the collateral for the loan they get from the bank. So they don't have any money, but they get a loan from the bank to buy the equipment, which is theirs, out of this arrangement. And it worked beautifully. And the nice thing about it, that most of the employees, if not all, were women, because it was a ready-made garment industry, which is a female employer, and many of the managers of the companies also were women. And the fact that they are close to their homes made it very easy for them to work. The same model applies for exporting companies that work with the informal sector, people at their homes, the producing things, and they are the ones that take it and marketing. Those models are actually practical models that exist in countries and can be scaled up. And of course, the improving the skills of women and the digital education is essential. How can G20 benefit from this? And this was going to be your question, so I'm answering it in advance. See that the link between the micro and the macro needs to be there. This is happening inside the countries, certain different attempts, okay? The G20 need to encourage the multilateral organizations and the governments of countries to scale up those successful attempts. Everything that goes for growing out of poverty, not just supporting women and children by giving aid money, but helping them grow out of poverty, okay? So the governments, the countries that apply that are the ones that would get a better treatment, even in debt relief. I mean, you take it to the macro level in all types of arrangements with them. I think this is how the G20 can help put the guidelines for the importance of growing out of poverty and for building up on what's happening in the communities, because there are great things that are happening in the communities all over the place. And the governments that help and support and scale up these would get advantages, at least in dealing with the multinational organizations.
Excellent. So we do have to keep some time for questions, but I have one final question for the panel, and perhaps you could integrate that in your responses to the questions that we get from the floor. And my question is the following. Given that 4 consecutive G20 presidencies are being held by developing and emerging markets, what are the issues, in your view, we should take forward in this conversation so we can shape the narrative and bring to the fore the unique set of macroeconomic and development challenges that the global South faces? So be it issues of poverty and inequality, the fact that inflation imposes disproportionate burden on the poor, debt sustainability issues which limit the fiscal space of the global South to invest in their development challenges or the climate challenge, issues of informality in the labor market. What would be your top 2 issues? And I'll now turn to the floor, and you can respond to my question when you are.
Sanjay from Macroeconomic Education. My question is to Madam Abla.
Shout, because it's bad.
Yeah. I'm Sanjay. I'm from Manipal Academy of Higher Education. My question is to Madam Veera. Is the plurilateral trade agreements a viable option to address the needs of the developing countries?
You are not going to like the answer. So, another one?
From Nigeria. My question is, I think it came since you were talking of the macro aspect. if there is more fiscal tightening, fiscal stimulus tends to spread to other countries. Fiscal tightening has less effect on other countries compared to monetary tightening. Because monetary tightening creates spillover in financial markets. So the combination of monetary and fiscal policy, I think G20 should try to capture this learning and communicate. Thank you.
Another one? The last.
Nagesh Kumar from ISI. My question is to Vera also. You referred to new rise of industrial policy, the new industrial policy and all that. Now, my mind went back to the earlier times when industrial policy was followed by many countries around the world. At that time, there were certain tools of industrial policy which were used, like local content requirements, whole host of performance requirements, which were outlawed or we lost the policy space to pursue them in some of the WTO agreements, trades program. And so you think with the rise of industrial policy in the biggest champions of free markets creates the possibility of retrieving those policy spaces back, and if G20 can do something about it. Thank you.
They are using, can I?
Yes, most of the
Go
questions.
ahead.
Yeah.
To the plurilaterals, it's the only way to go. But there's a problem. Some big countries, developing countries, are not agreeing to accept the plurilaterals inside the framework of WTO. Some developing countries. Not to mention, India is one. Let's see what's going on. That's for some special issues. Look, again, local content is here, is there. Mr. Trump introduced it in automobiles. The European Union became furious, and now they have a dual agreement. And what's going on subsidies? 1 trillion for the United States, 400 billion for the European Union, and for Japan, something the numbers is awful. It's also the same. So what's going on is a revival of the old industrial policy that lived in the past. On the what's going on again on the what's to say to the G20. Look, with all this mess in the area of standards, how the European Union can impose CBAM? How the European Union can say to you, your steel is not proper to get into Europe, if it's not considering the source of energy that you are using. Come on, Brazil use water. Other countries use coal. Without scope 1, 2, 3, come on. This is an impossible way to do. And how to get the point of the G20 is, I love the declaration of G7. And there is a phrase new for me. That is, we, President and First Ministers, we task our ministers to do such and such. Can you imagine if you have in G20, the G20 saying, we task your officials, our bureaucrats, and to do what? To do an exercise of equivalence. You accept the standard that can be real and contingent on the developing countries and developed countries. And then you can accept to create a rule. Without this, we are going to discuss on what? Different things. We are talking about different things. Again, deforestation. I agree. Brazil is the one that is really saying you are destroying the world because you're destroying the Amazon. My question is, yes, you are changing a lot on this. My point is, who is buying our rare wood? That's the point. You are destroying because somebody is buying it. About gold, do you know what's going on in Amazon? They are destroying a lot of things because of illegal gold mining. The question is, go to the numbers again, all to the numbers, all the time to the numbers. Do you know the biggest importer of gold? Not treasury gold, not monetary gold. I'll tell you, UK. Tell me, explain me, you developed countries. Who is buying? I'm not saying the second country that's buying the gold of Brazil. Who is certifying it? That's the point. What are the rules for certification? Without this, we are not going to reach any constructive end on the story of climate change.
Dr. Kim, on the question of synchronization.
Right. Yes, thank you for the question. And also, first of all, let me briefly answer to your questions about the global, what's the role of the G20 about the global South. I think that the sustainability impact assessment is now conducted in the EU level when we have a trade liberalization or trade integration. And then, so I think that this kind of the sustainability impact assessment must be widely spread and expanded in G20 level, but the G20 does not have that kind of the professional institutions, so I think that the other institutions can help or can report to the G20 on this kind of things. And to your questions, actually I don't like a synchronization of the economic policy. No, never, country by country, because in many cases, that kind of the synchronization would expand the more volatility, leads to the more volatility or instability. But because of after the pandemic, the characteristics of pandemic leads to the synchronization of the economic condition, macroeconomic condition in each country. So that's the reason why we are talking about the monetary synchronization in this, the communique and recommendations. But when we are thinking about the fiscal policy and the monetary policy of each countries after the pandemic, then more emphasis on the monetary policy of the synchronization. But in terms of fiscal policy, it differs country by country very much because of the fiscal condition of each government. I think that is very important point for how to harmonize not synchronization, but the harmonization of the macroeconomic policy. Need to think about the synchronization of the economic policies, not the cure method for recover this kind of things. We need to think about the side effect and adverse effect of the synchronization of the economic policy country by country.
Dr. Damori?
Okay. Yeah, there is no question for me, but I think...
My final question.
Yeah, all right, your final questions. I think there are a lot of things that the G20 can also provide. First one, is of course, I should underline my previous remark that the realizations of the tit for tat protectionisms and protectionist actions are not productive and detrimental. So actually, it is the G20 need to realize it, and also on the industrial policy, for example, G20 can come up with some kind of guidelines for the new industrial policy. It's more subtle. It's not really addressed under the WTO, but maybe. So maybe G20 can take initiative for that kind of guideline to separate the one that works. Some industrial policy are also good. So we have to separate the one that works for global economy and the one that are negatively affect the global economy. That kind of things might also help. And of course, the other things that I always repeat again and again, accelerate the WTO reform process. Well, that's the key for multilateral trading systems to work against. But one thing on the Professor Goyal's questions, I think G20 missed the opportunity of having synchronization last year. Yeah, because it was a critical time for monetary and fiscal policy synchronizations after we exit from the pandemic. But now it's better late than never. Although the burden is becoming harder to make these synchronizations work. But of course, the benefit is even higher at the moment.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the questions have been addressed. Let me say the important messages that I think are essential to be said. I think that G20 needs to start a process of avoiding dealing with the symptoms and dealing with the core problems for a change. Everything we are dealing with the symptoms. Okay, by the way, including even the standardization. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. The only reason we're talking about the minerals is because China is putting restrictions on the exports of minerals. Otherwise, we wouldn't talk about it. The trade system internationally is messed up. One of the key issues is the fact that WTO has a dispute settlement system that's not working because the US is actually blocking the appointment there. Okay. Yes. Yes. So I mean, these are all symptoms. The core problem is that the South is not visible, not only as a voice, but as members in the UN, in the World Bank, in the IMF. They are not there. The Bretton Woods Agreement needs to be changed. It does not fit anymore. It was done at a time after the Second World War with a certain division of power in the world that is not there anymore. It needs to be changed and respect the new situation. The world, the earth is not going to open and swallow Russia and China and then the rest will live happily ever after. Okay? It's not going to happen. Okay? We have to live with each other and we have to do that fast because what we're trying to do is fit the elephant that's in the picture here in a very small box. We have a system that's not working. The BRICS got created because the G20 is not addressing their needs. The G7 are looking at themselves. Yes, giving instructions to ministers to do whatever is not going to solve the problem. It's again dealing with the symptoms. We need to look now at where we can go. We need to put scenarios and do cost-benefit analysis for them and understand, because what we're doing is put rhetorics and say we need to change without talking about how to do the change. And if we keep things this way, a weird animal is going to develop and we might not be able to deal with it and it will be very ugly. We need to do something about that. Those
but
are
again,
the messages.
destroying the international organizations is not going to solve anything. You have to transform them. That's the point. Don't crash. That put them and said, you have to change. Do it. And not
the entire system, but the political willingness to change the system has to be there. It is not there yet. There is rhetoric, which is a beginning, but the actual political will is not there.
Do you know when the system will change? When we have another war. That's it. Go to the history and discover that the system will change only when you have a terrible
But then you
clash.
actually have a war. During wars, this is the time
Awful.
for change.
Yes, I think
and
that's
it's not happening.
We're completely out of time, but that's a very appropriate note to conclude because it's striking that most of the conversation in this group has been driven by geopolitical factors. And when we talk about the solutions, again, what's the how is that going to happen? It's being constrained by geopolitical factors. So that's a very appropriate note to, so it's the geopolitics which is driving the macroeconomics. And on that note, we're completely out of time. So thank you so much for a lively discussion.
Can I ask the panelists to come to the front of the stage for a picture?